Hey guys, it's Kevin in my review for the 355. And this film, we do center on the character of May. She is this spy of sorts that, of course, is also a CIA officer. And basically, one day she gets a hold of this device that could potentially start World War III and realizes this is such a deadly device that she's going to need to wrangle up a bunch of other spies globally from around the world in order to stop this terrorist organization. For the 355, look, this is the first movie of 2022. I know that this is usually a film I would talk about in my What I Watched video, but there aren't many new releases this month in terms of theatrical releases, and this is the first movie of the year, so I just felt it was kind of fitting to do an individual review for this one. That being said, this movie I was not really excited for at all. I felt like this is one of those movies that we got trailers for a long time. It kept getting pushed back, and any film that comes out in the first week of January, it's not usually that great of a sign. Simon Kinberg being behind it as well did not really inspire a lot of confidence. I was hoping that this film could be somewhat special, but I really wasn't holding out too much hope for it, and I have to say, it's pretty much what I expected. The 355 is an incredibly throwaway and generic spy film that we have seen 1,000 times before that really doesn't offer up much new in terms of anything worthwhile, but we are just going to get into it, starting off with the cast. For me, this is like the only real positive I have when it comes to this film. I think all of the acting here is really strong for the most part, but that's to be expected. These are really good actors. And I mean, Jessica Chastain, I will say this is not her greatest performance. Definitely not. This is not on the level of some of the other performances that she's given, but it's definitely better than her previous work with Simon Kinberg. I will say that for sure. I do think she overall does a good job of playing this character of May, someone that you can see is, there's a lot going on with her in this film. She is very unsure of how this is really going to go, but she also has a little bit more of a personal connection to this story, and I think overall she did do a pretty good job in this film. I did enjoy her acting, but I have to say, the other women that are surrounding her, I think, are really the big standouts of this film, specifically Lupita Nyong'o, who, look, even in films like this, where she really isn't given a lot to work with, Nyong'o still really does shine in this film. I mean, you really do like her character. You understand who she is. She's someone who used to be a spy and has kind of like taken time off for a while, and she really is like kind of pulled back into it, and you can see how much she really loves that drive to become a spy again, and I think that she does a really great job in this film. I think that she's definitely a character that a lot of people are going to enjoy, and I overall really did enjoy her performance here. Penelope Cruz might just be the standout of this entire movie for me. She kind of plays this woman that doesn't really want to be involved in any of this, but she's pulled in, and you can see how this is having an effect on her. She has some really fun comedic moments, but she also gives the film a little bit more of a heart in terms of, her family and things like that, and I think overall she does a good job at playing this character. Diane Kruger is very good here too, very much a badass in that way, and I really did enjoy her performance in this film. I think all of these women do work very well together. Bingbing Fan doesn't have a ton to do in this movie. She does not really come in until she doesn't really come in until, I would say, the third act of this film, but she still does give a pretty memorable performance here, and I think all these women do work very well together. I think that's easily the best part of this movie, and I think, the chemistry that they have, there's a lot of potential there. It's just way better than what this movie really does deserve. I think even when this movie isn't really working, they all still work very well together, and it's easily the best thing about this entire movie. As far as the rest of the cast goes, unfortunately, I can't really say that for them. Édgar Ramírez really is not that great here, but the one performance that I was very unimpressed by was Sebastian Stan in this movie, who, I gotta say, seemed extremely bored throughout this entire film. I can't say too much about his role in the movie, but he has not as much to do as you'd expect, and he has a little bit more later on, but his performance here was just incredibly unconvincing. I didn't really buy anything of what he was doing in this movie. I really felt like he was just kind of going through the motions, and I just was not a big fan of his performance here at all. What really does bring this movie down, though, is the directing here from Simon Kinberg, who, I gotta say, I know this is only a second film, but 2 films in, I really don't think this guy has it. I don't. I think that, yes, he is very good in terms of what he used to do when it comes to the X-Men films and things like that. I know he was like a producer for a while and all that stuff, and he's written quite a few films before, and he's not bad on that side of things. The problem is he lacks any sort of vision whatsoever. It doesn't really feel like Kinberg brings anything specific to the table when it comes to this film. It's very lifeless in terms of directing, and I think that makes this such a uninteresting experience. I think if this film had a more dynamic director who could really bring some kind of edge to this film, I think this movie really could have been something special, but Kinberg just doesn't really seem like he's into it. It doesn't really seem like he had any real drive whatsoever when it came to this movie. He kind of was just on autopilot when it came to the directing, and it really does show here. I mean, at times the movie can be fun, at times it can be dark, but it's so tonally inconsistent. I couldn't even tell you what Kinberg was really going for in terms of his directing, and that absolutely brings the movie down here. And that being said, though, I said his writing isn't as bad as his directing, but his screenplay doesn't really do a lot either. I mean, it really does leave a lot to be desired here, especially when it comes to the mission that these characters are on. You don't really care about it. It feels very throwaway. They have to find some kind of device, and they have to, make sure that that device is taken, doesn't end up falling into the wrong hands. Like, we've seen this story done a bunch of times before, and there really isn't a lot this film does to make that any more exciting here. There really isn't a lot that this film does to really get you on board when it comes to this story, and so I just wasn't super invested in what was going on there. But the thing that I was hoping could maybe keep me into this film are the characters. I was hoping that with these actresses, this film would do them justice and give them storylines that they really do deserve. And some of them, they do. I do think some of these storylines are somewhat compelling. I touched upon Lupita Nyong'o. I like her character's story and what really drives her as a character. She's probably the one that enjoys this mission the most. She hasn't been doing this for a little bit, and the fact that she's like pulled into it, I think there's something to latch onto when it comes to her character, and I enjoyed what they ended up doing with her. Penelope Cruz is very much the comedic relief of this film, where throughout most of this movie she kind of just wants to get away. She doesn't really want anything to do with this mission whatsoever, and though it's very repetitive, it surprisingly works very well, and I think it's really one of the only characters that I found that I could latch onto somewhat. And it's kind of pathetic that the simplest of characters is probably the best character in this entire movie, but I think overall they did a really good job with her. But Diane Kruger's character easily has the most missed potential, I think, out of everyone, because there's a lot that is going on with this character. There's a reason why she's in this life. She's kind of been forced into it, in a sense, because of ties to her father. But it's so surface level in terms of the way that we explore it. It's very much presented through exposition. We don't really get a sense of how she's gotten here or what she really plans to do. If she wants to be a spy, is she trying to abandon this? Does she want this to be her last mission? The film doesn't really dive that deep into it, and that was a real issue for me. I wanted more of a connection to her as a character because I thought that her setup was actually pretty good, but the film just does not lay the groundwork to really keep this character compelling. So while Kruger's performance, I think, is solid for sure, I think overall, when it comes to, the writing of her character, I think it is very weak overall, and I just wasn't a big fan of her. Even Bingbing fan in this movie, they don't really do that much with her. She's not really in this movie until the third act, and for me, I think that was a big mistake. I think you needed to pepper her more throughout this film, because there's something that happens with her in the third act that I should feel somewhat of an attachment to, but I really don't, because of the fact that I don't know this character all that well. They just kind of shoehorn her into the movie, and it really just felt like this was a last minute decision. They thought, okay, there can be a fifth woman, we can put her in here, we can just pluck her into the movie, and that'll be it. It didn't really feel like there was much thought put into this character, and I really wish they would have done more when it comes to her overall. So yeah, I just didn't really feel much of a connection to these characters. Unfortunately, the blandest of which is the main character of this movie. Jessica Chastain's character is so relentlessly boring in this film. There's not really much of anything to her. She has a relationship with Sebastian Stan. Something goes down, pulls her into this mission, and that's kind of it. She doesn't really, she's very impulsive. She, a lot of the time, will complicate things, and that's kind of it. There isn't really a lot to this character. There's not a lot that really drives her. There's not much you're connected to, but the film focuses so much on her, and I just don't understand it. I don't understand why this is the character that we're focusing on, because she's easily the least interesting out of everyone, but I think the movie feels like, because Jessica Chastain is the headliner of this film, that they have to make a concerted effort to focus the most on her, and I don't think they needed to. I think they need to put just as much effort into the other characters, and very often they don't. A lot of these characters very much feel like they're here because they need to be. They're here because they're plot devices, and I don't really feel like they dive into that very well at all. So like I said, I think that in terms of the screenplay, really does leave a lot to be desired, but there are some other things that really do bother me when it comes to this movie. There are some events that happen in this film, one in particular in the third act that should be very impactful for these characters. A lot of these characters should be heavily affected by it, and we should spend a lot of time on it, but it's one of those things where it happens, it's really intense, and then it's not really brought up again. It's brought up in one scene, you see how it's affecting one character, but all of the other characters seem completely unaffected by this event, and I'm just kind of like, what the hell? I was so baffled by this choice. Why even have this scene? Why even make this such a big deal if you're not even going to take the time to show how this affects any of these characters? What is the point of this? It just felt like they were needlessly upping the stakes for no reason, and I just wasn't a fan of it at all. I did not like the way they decided to write a lot of things in this movie. There's a twist that happens in this film that is incredibly obvious from the start. If you would have told me going in what's going to, if I were to make a prediction of what was going to happen in this film, I would have guessed this twist. I would have. I think it's the most obvious thing they could have potentially done. There's no mystery here whatsoever. They don't do a good job of trying to really build up anything. It just kind of feels like they needed a twist, and they threw this in, and I don't even think it needed to be there. I don't even think the inciting incident that happens needed to really happen. You could have just had what ends up happening as the twist happen from the beginning, and I think the movie is honestly kind of better because of it, because then you wouldn't have this pointless twist that I think was just kind of thrown in there. So yeah, there's a lot of things writing-wise here that I just don't think works very well here at all. I think the film is very poor in a lot of areas when it comes to that. The villains as well are absolutely nothing in this movie. They're just throwaway terrorists. They have a mission to blow things up, and that's kind of it. There's not really much of anything to them, and that's really all we get when it comes to their characters. There's nothing really that they're trying to explore in terms of that, and I think that definitely does bring the movie down. But the other thing that I think really does hurt this movie is the cinematography in this film, which, oh my god, I mean, I don't know how we are in 2022 and we are still getting action sequences filmed in the way they are in this movie. There is a overabundance of shaky cam here, which I didn't really understand. There's so many scenes in this movie that actually could be really good in terms of its action, but for some reason the movie doesn't want me to see any of it because it's constantly shaking around. There are so many scenes where where there's close-ups of actors, and I don't understand why they decided to go in that direction. I think that there's a lot of just the camera moving, and it's so hard to tell what's going on throughout the majority of it. There are all these awkward zoom-ins and things like that, and there's not a single action scene in this movie that's impressive as a result. There's not a single action scene in this movie that I enjoyed. It's honestly one of those films where whenever an action scene came up, I was like, oh god, we're doing this again. It just was so hard to watch at points, and I did not like any of the action here. It really felt like everything that's wrong when it comes to action sequences in this movie movie. I don't know who constructed it, but I just was not a fan of anything going on in terms of cinematography in this film. And aside from the action, the cinematography itself, it's very standard. There's really not much to it at all. I really was not a fan of anything going on. I don't know who's responsible for it, but I was not really a fan of the cinematography in this film at all. The score by Junkie XL, this is probably some of his weakest work to date. I didn't really feel the same sort of like passion and energy that he usually has in his scores. I just felt he was kind of just going through the motions here. And the other thing that really does hold this film back is the editing. There is no reason for this movie to be over 2 hours long. I really don't understand why it is. I think the first hour of this movie especially is such a slog to get through. I will say it does pick up a bit in the second half of in the second hour. I think it does pick up a bit, but it takes a long time for this movie to get interesting. A lot of the time it's just kind of going through the motions, and I just found myself so relentlessly bored by so many things that were happening in this movie. There's one scene where all of these characters are like discussing something around a table, and I thought there was going to be something interesting going on there. I thought overall that they were going to discuss something interesting, but it was like the most bland conversation you could think of, and I felt like you could have cut that scene out of the movie entirely. There's so many things they could have cut out of this movie, and I think the film would have been much better overall. Focus more on the characters, focus more on the purpose of why everyone's here, and I think this movie could have been something special, but unfortunately it is just far too generic for me to really recommend this overall. I think this film unfortunately was everything that I really feared it would be. It has such lifeless direction from Simon Kinberg, very shoddy looking action that makes it very hard to even pay attention to what is really going on, and overall I just was not a fan of how this was. It goes in a lot of dumb directions that I don't really think it earns any of. There's a very obvious twist that's going on. It does have some really strong performances. Lupita Nyong'o, Diane Krueger, and Penelope Cruz especially. I think those three are really the big standouts in this film. I think this film could have been something really special, really poignant. I think it could have had some really interesting directions and dive into some really interesting storylines for these characters. But unfortunately, what this movie really does come down to is just a really generic and highly uninspired spy movie that you've seen 1,000 times before in way better films. And so, unfortunately, because of that, I think this is a really forgettable film overall. So I am going to give it a C-. I honestly don't know why this film came to theaters. I know it's going to be on Peacock in like 45 days, and honestly, I would just encourage y'all to wait for that, because I don't really think this film does anything that special to like warrant a theatrical release. I would have just put this on a streaming service, because I honestly think it probably would have done a lot better. Like, this movie is bombing horribly right now, mainly because I just don't think people are all that interested in it. But other than that, guys, did my review of the 355. Let me know what you guys saw this movie overall, left your thoughts, and we'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.